session. So again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And we have people logging in now, so we're going to give it just a couple of minutes and then we'll get started with our formal program. Great. So more people are coming in, and for those of you who are just joining us, we are recording this session. And I'd like to, again, thanks everyone for being with us this afternoon. Thanks to Ben Hunkler for hosting and preparing this session, and Ted Bettner, who you'll hear from more after a brief introduction. Great. So good afternoon. My name is Joanne Kilgour, and I serve as the Executive Director here for the Ohio River Valley Institute. Again, I'd like to express our gratitude for you joining us today for the release of this new report, Staying Alive, The Last Days of Stripper Wells in the Ohio River Valley, authored by Ted Bettner, who is here with us this afternoon to present his findings. Earlier this year, Ted also produced a report on repairing the damage from orphaned and abandoned wells throughout the country and in the Ohio Valley in particular. And since the release of that report, Congress has taken steps to address some of those non-producing wells, but a potentially larger crisis is brewing. While the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 could provide over $1 billion of funding for Ohio River Valley states to plug and remediate orphan wells, it won't directly address the more than $12 billion in unfunded liabilities associated with active wells, like the marginal wells addressed in this report. For this morning's program, we'll provide an overview of the report, and then we're also happy to field your questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat function, and we'll collect those questions and then have a Q&A session at the end of the formal program. I'm now pleased to hand over the mic to Ted Bettner. Ted.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joanne, for that great introduction. Can everybody see the slides? Great. Okay, so just to give you sort of an overview of this report and why we're looking at it, the report looks at stripper wells in Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia by exploring the growth and production, the number of wells. It also looks at well ownership, bonding, decommissioning costs, methane emissions, and looks at some of the tax preferences that these wells receive. It also looks at some of the wells that are producing even less, that are producing a very small amounts, what are called these uneconomical wells. And it's going to propose some remedies to ensure that industry pays for the cleanup costs. As Joanne mentioned too, the context for this discussion is that there is money going toward orphan well cleanup, 4.7 billion, and that these 4 states would probably get around $1 billion of that because we live in an area where the oil boom first happened and where a lot of these old orphan wells are. And also this is an important moment too, because this money will also let us fund other wells and to do a whole host of things to identify methane emissions and which wells need to be plugged. Also, the U.S. energy system, as people know, is moving away from fossil fuels. So we have to take a real strong look at the liabilities of all these older wells because we could see a drastic reduction in oil and gas production. Also, the fracking boom in Appalachia and how it's driving production. What has this meant for stripper wells? Recently, Diversified Energy was featured in an article in Bloomberg. And they were identified as an empire of dying wells in Appalachia. And this showed how vulnerable these states are in Appalachia to one company having over 60,000 wells just in their portfolio. What would happen if they went bankrupt or went out of business? Do they have the funds necessary to clean up the cost of all of their asset retirement obligations? Good question. So this is sort of the reasons that we looked at this issue and we're talking about it today. So first off, what is a stripper well? Why are we interested in this? It is sort of an obscure thing. You don't hear too much about them, but generally speaking, they're low producing oil and gas wells that usually operate on the edge of profitability. Sometimes they're called a marginal well. Stripper wells produce less than about 15 barrels of oil or 90,000 cubic feet of natural gas per day. So anything below that, it's called a stripper well. And sometimes that's looked at as a barrel of oil equivalent per day, or BOE D. You'll see that sometimes in the report. And they're called strippers because operators theoretically strip the last remaining value out of the ground before they retired. And these wells are producing a very small amount of gas. So just to give you an example, the average stripper well produces about 7,000 cubic feet of gas per day, where a new horizontal fracking well produces about 30,000. So that's about 4,500 times as much as a stripper well. So these wells are producing very little compared to what we've seen with the shale boom in the region. Oop, got way ahead of myself there, sorry. Anyway, so stripper wells, let's look at how many do we have? One of the big findings of this report too is that stripper wells comprise 92% of active oil and gas wells in the 4-state region. And all the discussion that we hear, especially the last decade, has been on fracking wells, and they're just a very small portion of that huge percent. So stripper wells make up most of the wells, while most of the production is coming from those high volume fracking wells. And what we've seen since the year 2000 is a 42% increase in stripper wells. So they've gone from about 125,000 to over 177,000. So there's far more stripper wells today than there were, more than 2 decades, about 2 decades ago. And we look a little closer, we look at stripper wells that are producing less than 1 barrel of oil equivalent today have risen significantly. So the number of ultra low producing stripper wells has doubled. You can look in that chart, they used to comprise about half of all stripper wells. Now it's about 3/4 as we look in 2019. And this is a chart that looks at stripper oil and gas production in the Ohio River Valley. And what you can tell there is stripper well gas production has declined by 44%, or 237 billion cubic feet from 2008, right at the beginning of the fracking boom, to 2019. They used to make up about 81% of our total gas production. Now it's less than 3%. And with that, the productivity has declined too. So we have a lot more wells. These wells are producing a lot less gas than they used to. So that helps us understand and identify this as a growing problem because of that fracking boom, we've seen a decline in production from these wells, but we also have a lot more wells. One thing we looked at this report too is stripper well ownership. Sometimes it gets portrayed in the media or by politicians that a lot of these stripper well owners are just mom and pop companies, and that's who owns most of these stripper wells. So this is partly some of the reasons that we give tax subsidies to these groups. But we examined the stripper wells in this region and found that just 17 companies own nearly half of all stripper wells. And these 17 companies have at least 1,000 stripper wells. And as we all know, Diversified Energy, they have about 50,000 stripper wells in this region. So they have about 63,000 wells, and about 50,000 of those are stripper wells. And some of the other wells that they have are horizontal. Some of the other wells that they have are inactive as well. But they are the largest stripper well owner in the region. So they own about nearly 30% of all the stripper wells in the 4-state region are owned by Diversified. And Diversified is responsible for about 43% of all of the production. Yep, sorry about that. And one of the things that, when we're talking about all these wells, so we've seen the number of stripper wells grow by about 40%. But what doesn't stop growing is the amount of asset retirement, the liabilities of these wells. So one thing we looked at in this report was looked at the bonding coverage, like what are these wells being bonded at and how much does that cost? And what we found is the average stripper well has about $214 of bonding coverage, and that a low estimated cost to plug just one single well is about $30,000. And one thing that we asked ourselves, well, if stripper wells had to be bonded at the full cost, how much would that cost? And we estimated that it would be about $134 million annual in premiums for this coverage. So bonding companies, whether it's certain types of bonds that they get, they have to pay an annual premium on those bonds. And if they had to pay that on $30,000 per well, we estimate that that would amount to about $134 million a year. So when we look at the total bonding coverage of all of the 177,000 wells, we find that it's actually less than 40 million. And the 134 million mentioned above is annually, and we're talking about $40 million. So the total bonding coverage for all the stripper wells in the 4-state region is about $40 million. And that's about 0.7% of the cost. And we've identified the cost would be between 5 billion and 16 billion. And that 5 billion figure is using a plugging cost of just $30,000 per well. That is certainly at the low end of that spectrum. But because we don't have full cost bonding, this is a huge risk to all of these states. That liability is being put on to the citizens and the people of these states that have to shoulder that. Because as we've seen over the last decade, a lot of these companies are going, some of them are going bankrupt, and some of them are transferring these wells to other operators. But what doesn't transfer is that risk that all of these wells, the companies are legally obligated to plug and restore these well sites. And what we found is that the bonding coverage is just very low. It's insufficient. It's nowhere near where it needs to be in order to tackle that problem. Another thing that we looked at in the report was tax benefits to stripper wells. So stripper wells are largely exempt from state production taxes, and that's true here in West Virginia. And the federal government also provides hundreds of millions in tax subsidies to stripper wells. And one of the biggest tax subsidies that we identified in the report is the marginal well tax credit. And for years, this credit was not obtained because of the criteria needed to meet the credit, because gas prices were too high. But as gas prices got lower, this credit became very useful. And it's estimated that in 2022, the amount of the credit would be $320 million for stripper operators. That's a very large amount of credit for just a small fraction of the production of oil and gas in the country. Another thing that we looked at was emission levels of methane from stripper wells. And we estimated that the 177,000 stripper wells in the 4-state region emit approximately 199,000 tons of methane annually. And this was based on a report on a study by Amy Townsend Small that we used to look at emissions, average emissions per low producing well or a stripper well. And this is the equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions of about 12.5 billion miles driven by an average passenger vehicle, or about 1.3 power plants in 1 year. So these wells in the 4-state region are emitting a little over one typical coal plant in 1 year. So it's not an insignificant amount. And the picture down here below is actually from the Bloomberg story that I mentioned earlier, and it shows some of that methane leakage in that separator tank. Okay, another thing that we looked at in this report that was unique is we know stripper wells are producing, very little. We talked about that, how much they're producing per day on average. And what we tried to do is say, well, let's look at how many of these stripper wells are uneconomical. And there was a recent study done by the University of Pittsburgh that looked into that and tried to figure out exactly what the production threshold would be for some of these wells to be uneconomical, even if prices rise dramatically. And based on that analysis, what we found is that more than 1 in 7, about 31,000 of active stripper wells in the 4-state region are uneconomical. They're producing less than 0.5 thousand cubic feet of gas. And that arguably that these wells need to be decommissioned. And one of the other crucial findings of this report is also that on top of these uneconomical wells, these 31,000, there are an additional 192,000 inactive wells that likely need to be decommissioned. And let's think back to the numbers that we used earlier. If you're looking at just $30,000 per well to plug this is, where you get into billions of dollars to take care of this. And we know the bonding coverage is very low and cannot adequately cover this. So when we looked at some of these, we found that a lot of the wells that you see in the red there, the one that says no reported production, they're inactive. A lot of these wells haven't, a lot of the operators that own these wells haven't even submitted reports to the various agencies. And some of them have no reported production whatsoever. And operators in the 4 states and any state in this country, they're legally obligated to plug these wells. So one question arises from this discussion is, if we have wells with no reported production, why aren't they being plugged and abandoned? Or why aren't the well sites being restored? And it's a very good question. And part of it is that there is sort of this tacit agreement to get these wells to produce, to be unplugged for as long as possible. That's part of the reason we're seeing that. We don't have the enforcement mechanism needed to hold this industry accountable. So one of the last parts of the study was, well, what would it take to have sufficient amount of money over the course, of about 25 years, if we were going to, do this and have enough money to pay for plugging and abandonment of all of these wells that we're talking about. And this isn't the stripper wells. This is about about 400,000 that we identified earlier that are unplugged, active, and inactive wells in the region. So all of these wells need to be plugged. These well sites need to be cleaned up. And the problem is, as we talked about earlier, there's insufficient money in the bonding regimes to pay for this. So one way to get around that is to implement a small fee on production. And this was proposed in West Virginia in a bill called the Orphaned Well Prevention Act that was introduced last year, earlier this year in the West Virginia legislature. So we sort of built upon this idea of, like, what would it take if how much money will we need what kind of fee would we need to enable these states to pay for this plugging cost? And it's actually not too much. So in Pennsylvania, if they had a fee of about 3 cents per 1,000 cubic feet, they could cover the cost of plugging these wells. And Ohio's 7 cents, and West Virginia was about 5 cents. We looked at Kentucky too, and one of the interesting things about Kentucky is unlike Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, in the future, they're not going to be producing much more oil and gas than they are today, at least according to the Energy Information Administration, which this data is based on. These projections are based on. So Kentucky is actually going to have to look at implementing a fee and looking for other revenue sources to deal with that. They're in a very precarious position because they have a large amount of wells that need to be plugged and abandoned, and very little production compared to the states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Oops. Sorry about that. So the big takeaway from all of this whole report and why we looked at it was that we have more stripper wells, and they've grown dramatically over the last 2 decades. And they're producing a lot less gas than they used to. And looking forward, there's a good chance a lot of these wells will become inactive and they will need to be plugged and abandoned by state agencies. But we also found that this growth in stripper wells did not happen by accident. It was driven by a combination of policies. Some of those policies include tax subsidies at the state and federal level, but also lax regulation to keep wells unplugged for as long as possible. And just to give you an example, one thing we highlighted in the report was that every year the International Oil and Gas Compact Commission issues a report on marginal wells. The last report they put out was in 2016. And in that report, they make a case that every stripper well or well that's not plugged, that's unplugged, has lost revenue. And that's just not the case. A lot of these wells are producing so less that they're not viable. Or as we looked at in this report, they're uneconomical, and that and state regulators need to take that into consideration. And if state regulators and stripper well operators are mistaken in their assumption that the wells will be restarted in the future, which research has shown that not to be the case, these policies are masking billions of potential liabilities, as operators could go bankrupt or out of business. This could result in the creation of thousands of more orphan wells, for which the state and taxpayers would end up absorbing the decommissioning costs. So in conclusion, states need to act swiftly to require the oil and gas industry to set aside enough money to plug their wells and restore well sites, even if their owners are no longer in business. Because today, we have close to about 28,000 documented orphaned gas wells in the 4-state region. And that is just a tiny fraction of the 400,000 wells that we were talking about today. And most of those wells, those 400,000, need to be arguably plugged and need to be decommissioned, and they're not. And we only have a very small, narrow window over the next decade or 2 decades to ensure that industry pays for that. Because as we talked about earlier, more utilities and states are moving towards cheaper energy, which is mostly renewable energy. And as that happens, we're going to see less production from the gas sector in particular. So the time to do this is now. Otherwise, it will be state taxpayers that hold it back. Great. Thanks, everybody. I'm willing to take questions too if you want me to.
Thank you so much, Ted. It was great to see those graphs and charts and get a better sense of what's in the report. For those who have joined us, please feel free to either use the chat or Q&A function, and we can get your questions to Ted. And yeah. Ted, I'll ask you a question while we're giving people a chance to let some of this sink in, which is just, do you think that this is kind of an underrepresented issue in the field of oil and gas issues and kind of questions about this sector in general?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think part of the issue too, this is sort of an obscure topic to talk about stripper wells. And it's something that hasn't been talked about too much because all of the focus has been on the hydraulic fracking wells, the big producing wells in the region. And I think it's been unnoticed that this is a growing problem, you know, and I think that was the purpose of this report, is to really dive into those details, to look at, you know, who owns these wells, are they growing in nature, and what are their liabilities? And have states protected themselves from those liabilities? And we're not talking about like a few $100,000 here or a couple million here. We're talking about billions of dollars. You know, if you woke up and realized like our state's on the hook for billions of dollars in these liabilities from stripper wells operators, most of which don't have almost none of them have the insufficient amount of bonding to cover these. And plus, many of these businesses go out of business all the time, or they transfer their wells. And state regulations are such that they're just holding on to them, not doing anything with them. They have no finance, there's no financial incentive to plug a well. That costs money and it costs revenue. And I think, why would you do, if you're a company, you're like, I'll just hold on to the well until they're forcing me to plug it. And the problem is states aren't forcing them to do that. And that's a huge problem because we all agree eventually these have to be plugged. And I think stripper wells just make up, like we talked about earlier, they make up 92% of the wells. You know, and each of those wells represent at least $30,000, upwards of 120. It all depends on, you know, each well and how that's determined. And I think for a large part, it's like this is something that's flown under the radar over the last couple of years. And I'll tell honestly, doing the report, you know, like there wasn't much written about stripper wells. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the report is that we're sort of breaking new ground. I haven't seen really good analysis about the liabilities associated with stripper wells. You know, there's been very little bit on the ownership of wells, especially at a regional level. So I think it highlights this growing problem of what are we going to do as state in these states.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to ask them both to you and then repeat the first one so that you see kind of what they are. But so the first question is, how, if at all, are the stripper wells underfunding for closure hindering or retarding the adoption of renewable energy? And with tax subsidies as well, how are they distorting the market for purposes of the push to clean energy? So the first question is related to, is the underfunding of closure for these marginal wells, these stripper wells, hindering the adoption of renewable energy?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'll just give you just one little example. In the state of West Virginia, they just adopted bonding for solar, and that, you know, their minimum bonding per solar, solar facility or operation was $150,000, for the cleanup costs. And our minimum bonding for a single well in some states is $2,500. And, the bonding, picture here, when you get into oil and gas too, you're talking about something that can never actually be repaired. It's kind of like coal mining in the sense of reclamation, but I think what's happened too is that when industries don't have to absorb the full costs of their decommissioning, it is an implicit subsidy to that industry, and it distorts the price of, of what we're paying. So if industry was forced to pay the actual costs, or forced to pay at least a premium on a bond, which a lot of the stripper well companies would have a very difficult time getting, the fact of the matter is you have to question whether they should be in business if they can't do that. And obviously, if we look at that picture and we see that it does have distortion effects because it's a market, it's an inefficiency in that process. It is dramatically lowering the cost of especially gas production in Appalachia, which makes it less, which makes it more competitive. So if they had to absorb more of those costs, I think you would see renewable energy like solar and things be a lot more competitive, and in terms of for the states as a whole.
Great. And then Ted, the follow-up question to that was whether the tax subsidies and some of the tax framework for the stripper wells might be distorting the market.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We talked about, the fact that just at the federal level, and there's all types in the report, we talk about percentage depletion and some other things, other tax subsidies that get. But in most part, they're not paying, like in West Virginia, for instance, they're not paying the severance tax, or very little. They're getting exempted from that. And I think a long time ago, if you go back 12 years ago or 20, you can make a case that it was in the best interest of states to keep these wells alive, producing, because it's helping. But the fact of the matter is they're producing less than they have before with all of these subsidies. And also they're producing a hell of a lot more of liability, as we talked about. But also in the age of like fracking, it's hard to make a case that these wells are here to protect our national energy security. And that was usually the case made to Congress, whether it was the 70s, 80s, 90s, that these wells needed to be subsidized because it's in the national economic and national security of this country to do so. And now that's just not the case. So a part of that argument is swiftly going away.
Thanks, Ted. So this next question is 3 separate questions. I'm going to ask them to you as a set, and then again, we can take them individually. So part of this is a technical question, which is, are most of the strippers vertical conventional wells? And so maybe I'll just pause there and let you respond to that.
Yes. Yeah, so there are some horizontal wells that are producing at a level less than 15 barrels of oil equivalent, or 90,000 cubic feet of gas. But most of the horizontal wells are producing more than that. We've had horizontal wells for a long time. This isn't something new. Most of the wells that we're talking about are conventional in nature. So I believe less than 1% or horizontal. And some of those horizontal wells are in like Kentucky. They actually have some of these older horizontal wells. But that's very different. You can have horizontal wells without them being, high volume shale fracking wells. And I think that's part of the confusion. But yes, they are conventional.
And in your research, did you uncover whether states have adequate bonding for horizontal wells that use high volume hydraulic fracturing?
Yeah, we looked at that in a previous report that you mentioned, Joanne, too, when we looked at orphan wells. Yeah, it is a little higher in some states. And part of the phenomenon, part of the things I didn't discuss that's in the report, I should have mentioned this too, is blanket bonding. So a blanket bond is when you say, well, you only like for conventional wells, it's about $25,000. And, depends on the state, but it's around there for like West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And then you have blanket bonds as well. and they can be higher, like $250,000. But I mean, most of the high volume wells that we're talking about, if you own more than just a couple, you're going to get a blanket bond for those wells. So if you're EQT and Taro, you're not buying single well bonds, you're getting a blanket bond. But the liabilities on those wells, the bonding ratio is, can be a little higher on those wells, but it's still, in that 1% range of the cost. Because we have to remember these unconventional fracking wells can cost up to $100,000, and that's generally speaking at the low end of decommissioning. So that's why they're a little higher. But when you look at the bonding ratio, are they bonded better? Very little better, very little, very, maybe a little bit higher, but not real, but not, nothing close to where they should be.
Great. So the next part of this question is related to any movement on bills or legislation in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, or Kentucky to remedy these issues like bond reform, plugging fees, or others. And I can just quickly mention that, Pennsylvania, the Environmental Quality Board in Pennsylvania has accepted to move forward a petition that was filed by several organizations to adopt better bonding. But are there other initiatives that you would mention in that effort?
Yeah, I think the best one, is the Orphan Well Prevention Act that was introduced in West Virginia. According to the legislation that I've looked at in the states, that was the one that really comprehensively solves the problem. So one of the issues I think you can have with full cost bonding, so if we require all these companies to have full cost bonding, so that they would pay an annual premium on the total cost of the estimated cost of decommissioning all of their wells. And there's a risk there that a lot of the stripper well companies, the low producers, would not be able to meet that. And what we don't want to do is make the orphan well problem worse. And I think there's a risk if you did that, a lot of stripper well businesses would go out of business because, and I think for the most part, most of these stripper well companies outside of the 17 we talked about earlier, they would have a lot of trouble just getting bonding in the first place. And I don't think they could, my understanding talking to folks too, they would not be able to get it. So what would happen in that scenario is we'd have an avalanche of orphan wells that state taxpayer, us, the public, would have to pay for. And I think we want to be very careful about that. And it's, very similar to the abandoned mineland fund at the federal level that goes to address the thousands of abandoned coal mines from 1977 prior. I think the only way, not the only, but one of the best ways, if we want the industry to pay for this, which they should be absorbing their costs, would be to look at a fee on production. And most of that production, like we talked about earlier, would come mostly from the high volume shale drilling that's taken place. And I think, full cost bonding would be great if we did that at the very beginning, like 20 years ago. And I think it still should be looked at as a way to hold the industry liable for these costs. But I think that you do run a risk by doing that. And it's and I just don't think a lot of these stripper well operators were able to get the bonding because they just they're not capitalized to be able to do that.
Thank you. So we have an additional question. Do regulators in the 4 states that you've covered have the power to limit license transfers? And if so, do they use those powers to prevent judgment proofing? Is there resort to judicial review for those license transfers for fraudulent conveyance?
That is a really good question. And we did not look into that specific issue in this report. That is definitely something I would love to dive into, but I don't want to speak about things I don't know the exact answer to.
But we do have contact information through the sign up for folks who've registered and asked questions. So we can also follow up and have some of these questions offline, or feel free to email us if you have questions that we either weren't able to answer here or that come up for you after the session has closed.
Yeah, I mean, I will give you one example of when we're talking about transferring wells too. So Diversified Energy has agreements with these 4 states that we talked about: Kentucky, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And those agreements, contain performance bonding that they've agreed to. And I believe if you add up all of the states, it's between 10 and 12. I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's between 10 or $20 million in performance bonding. But then again, if you look at Diversified, if you think of the wells that they have, their liability is at least 2 billion, around the $2 billion range. But states, signed agreements to allow, these wells, to be transferred and for them to be in these agreements with these states to be able to do that, because there's such a risk. And we've seen it all across the country and in other countries as well, that when wells get transferred from EQT to like Diversified, there's a reason. Why are they transferring those wells? Why do they think they're not productive, and Diversified thinks they are? So a lot of companies end up transferring these old wells when they're no longer producing at paying quantities that they found are profitable. So you always want to risk when these things get transferred, they can get transferred to a company that isn't financially capable of making them work, and that could go bankrupt. And I think that's what we've seen.
Thank you. Great. Well, I don't see any additional questions in the chat or the Q&A. So Ted, I really appreciate you taking the time to respond to these questions and for presenting your research today. And to everyone who logged in, we really appreciate your participation. And again, feel free to be in touch with Ted or with any of us if you'd like to do any follow-up offline.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much. Have a good afternoon.